All right, welcome back. This is the first presentation of our state and local government supplement that is in the 14th OK Essentials edition of this text. This is providing you with sort of a bottom-up look at federalism. And it's the sense in which, again, state and local governments oftentimes will have different priorities. They'll have different approaches. Based on different states and the different contexts. An important concept we're going to look at today is this idea of just revenue capacity. Where does the tax, where does the money come from each level of government? We'll talk about this when we get to later presentations as well. Key topics, again, I don't feel the need to read this out to you. You can read them. I'll give you a minute to take a look at it. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And now we're going to move on. Here are the student learning objectives. And again, I'll give you a few seconds to take a look at that. Okay, now, what state and local government does and why it matters. Local governments, again, are often responsive to different constituencies than those that influence state governments. And in the supplement, we talk about this woman, Dr. Tamara Mix, who was a homeowner in Stillwater. She was a faculty member at Oklahoma State. And she discovered that they were fracking in her neighborhood, and that was something that they didn't like. They kind of, the neighborhood and different property owners in Stillwater persuaded the government of Stillwater to ban fracking. Well, that did not sit well with the state legislature, who, again, the legislature are definitely very responsive to the oil and gas interests here in Oklahoma. So while local governments are highly responsive to the needs and demands of homeowners, state governments generally respond to the needs and demands of the most powerful economic interests in their states. And so there are two really important points. A lot of governing takes place at the local level, and state governments exert considerable influence over the actions of local governments. There are differences within and across states. Of course, you've got 50 states, and just in terms of geography, Alaska has over 665,000 square miles, while Rhode Island barely traverses 1,500 square miles. In terms of population, obviously California has probably more than 40 million citizens these days, while Wyoming has a population of just over 582,000. There are also significant differences between states in close proximity. When you look at Lewiston, Idaho, and Clarkson, Washington, the citizens of Washington, because it's a state that is dominated by coastal Democrats, they're a lot more liberal, in terms of people being able to have access to marijuana and things like that. And folks in Idaho are a lot more conservative. And so there are, again, significant consequences to living and working in one community as opposed to another. If you look at the differences between Loudoun County, Virginia, and Jefferson County, West Virginia, it's the same thing. The populations really starting around 2000 began diverging quite significantly, with Loudoun County moving much more in a liberal direction. The median income rose dramatically, and people in Loudoun County began voting for Democrats at a much higher rate. And the opposite kind of was happening in Jefferson County, where again the median income really didn't rise, and where the population pretty much persisted in supporting Republicans. Increasingly sharp disagreements within communities also exist over precious resources. There's a town up in Minnesota called Ely, Minnesota, in a part of Minnesota that historically has been mining country, but it's also increasingly, I mean, it's a beautiful place. There's a lot of, it's a huge watershed. And so there's, you've got a competition between people who want to mine and people who want the natural beauty of that region to be preserved for ecotourism. So again, these are the kinds of conflicts that are oftentimes emerging at the local level. So state and local governments are important actors. The framers created federalism as, again, a kind of novel compromise by establishing a compound republic. The Constitutional Convention delegates debated whether to give the federal Congress the authority to veto state laws. They ultimately rejected that. Again, while James Madison wanted a stronger federal government, a stronger national government than the one adopted at the convention, he nevertheless defended it on the grounds that it provided a sense of double security. Remember what we were talking about, this idea of you have the separation of powers, which provides horizontal protection, and then you have federalism as creating sort of a vertical check on the centralization of power. So for a long period of time, really from the convention, from the ratification of the Constitution, and well into the 20th century, the smaller states, the slaveholding states, state governments really dominated the governing process, and that actually had the effect of to some extent retarding the establishment of a large central administrative state that is sort of a hallmark of most modern governments. So the rural and agrarian nature of most states meant that most of the governing decisions were made at the state and local level. Likewise, the interpretation of federalism, dual federalism, which we mentioned in our previous discussions, served both to protect citizens from potential intrusion by the federal government, but more importantly, it protected the property rights of slaveholders. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. When you're talking about, the idea of federalism, it was an expedient to try and reassure the slave states and the elites that owned slaves and whose wealth was invested in slaves. The federal government wouldn't do anything about it, at least for a time. So what caused that interpretation of federalism to change? Again, you have a shifting balance. The growth of huge, increasingly monopolistic interstate conglomerates. Again, what happened? We had the Civil War, and then you had the Industrial Revolution, and that gave rise, again, remember, there is very little in the way of a federal government to really regulate how the economy is growing in this period. And so you get capitalism emerging sort of with very little other than state governments to do anything about it. And think about a lot of the things that are happening are interstate in nature: the growth of the railroads, the banking system, the mining, industries. These are all interstate in nature and very difficult for individual states to regulate. And so that gives rise to the progressive era, which again, you're attempting to use the federal government to reform, our government, and again, one of the bywords of the progressive era was this idea of good government. In fact, it was one of their monikers. People derisively called them goo-goos. So state governments, again, were oftentimes, repositories of resistance to that kind of reform because, again, they were dominated by the powerful economic interests of their states. So, again, either the state governments were corrupt, or they were ineffective, or they were simply inept. So over the course of the progressive era, some states responded and professionalized and significantly expanded their governing capacity, while other states remained largely incompetent. I briefly mentioned two reforms, the 16th and 17th Amendment. The 16th Amendment creates a national basis for an income tax, which really is the most efficient way of deriving revenue. And the 17th Amendment provides for the direct statewide election of senators, which are two very significant of the four amendments to the Constitution in that period. Those two are really important. The Great Depression changes everything. Again, you have the collapse of economic productivity and enormous surges of unemployment that devastated economies, throughout the country. Most states were absolutely prostrated by the Great Depression. The ineffectiveness of the Hoover administration's attempts to respond to the Great Depression alienated a critical mass of Americans. It's important to keep in mind, Republicans, they took a shellacking from 1930 until well into the 1960s, and that was largely owing, on the one hand, to the Great Depression, and then to people just becoming routinized to supporting one party over the other. People just, and it wasn't like it was, it went from being, with Republicans in the advantage prior to the Great Depression, suddenly they were irrelevant. Okay, it wasn't like it went from 55 to 45, Republicans Democrat to 80 Democrat, 20 Republican, but it seemed that way. And Democrats had durable control of the national government in that period, and they won most of the big arguments because they were winning most of the elections. But it wasn't like it was like Democrats didn't have to fight. They did. So again, in 1932, as we mentioned in a previous presentation, Democratic presidential challenger Franklin Delano Roosevelt campaigned on the idea of a New Deal, and those New Deal programs fundamentally altered the relationship between the federal government and the states, and between the federal government and American citizens. And you had dramatic expansions in federal domestic spending. Federal grants to states expanded from $250 million in 1932 to $2.9 billion by 1934. It's a very brief period of time and a lot of money. An illustration of the kinds of the impact of all that spending. The Hill-Burton Act really creates the physical infrastructure of our modern healthcare system. Prior to that law being passed, most towns didn't have hospitals. There really wasn't, when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about the physical things that make healthcare necessary, possible. And medical schools and hospitals are critical to that. And it's important to keep in mind that one of the, kind of a foreshadowing of all this was the 1920 and 21 Spanish influenza pandemic, which killed, nearly 500,000 Americans at a time when that was a significant number of people. And there were just people in warehouses, that were struck by this influenza. That they couldn't be helped, and they died, and it had a profound impact on American, on the way Americans viewed public health in that period. But it's instructive that it took over 20 years to get the arguments in place and to basically make the case that this sort of thing, this sort of dramatic investment in public health was required. So the New Deal led to a fundamentally different approach to federal and state relationships. We talked about this idea of cooperative federalism. By the mid-20th century, you still had vast disparities in the competence of state governments. In the 1960s, again, saw a wave of reforms at the state level that began to improve the effectiveness of state governments. And so that's the end of this presentation. When we come back, we will continue talking about state and local government and how the relationship between the federal government and state and local governments has evolved over time.